The morning sky over Washington turned red without warning. Colonel Daniel was drinking his third cup of coffee when every screen in the Pentagon Command Center flickered and died. For 3 seconds there was only darkness and silence. Then the screens came back to life, showing something that made his coffee cup slip from his fingers and shatter on the floor. Ships, thousands of them. They hung in orbit above Earth like a swarm of metal insects blocking out the sun. Daniel had spent 20 years in the military and had seen many terrible things, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Nothing could prepare any human being for the sight of an alien invasion fleet. The phone on his desk rang, and he answered it with a hand that refused to stop shaking. The voice on the other end belonged to General, and he sounded like a man who had already accepted death. They were everywhere, over every major city, over every military base, over every nuclear facility. 17,000 warships according to satellite data, and each one was larger than anything humanity had ever built. Daniel walked to the main display where a young scientist named Laura was working frantically at a console. She was from NASA and had been brought in 2 hours ago when the first ships appeared. Her job was to make sense of the signals the aliens were broadcasting, but the look on her face told Daniel she wished she had never learned what they were saying. "They want us to surrender," she said without looking up from her screen. "They call themselves the Dominion, and they have conquered over 3,000 worlds. They say Earth is now property of their empire, and we have 6 hours to accept their terms." Daniel asked what would happen if humanity refused. Laura finally looked at him, and her eyes were red from crying. She said they would burn every city to ash and harvest whatever remained. That was the word they used, harvest. Like humans were nothing more than crops to be collected. The next few hours were chaos. World leaders tried to coordinate responses, but there was nothing to coordinate. Human weapons were useless against shields that could stop nuclear missiles. Human aircraft were swatted from the sky like flies. In China, a desperate military commander launched everything he had at one of the smaller alien vessels and accomplished nothing except making the invaders angry. They responded by erasing Shanghai from the map. 30 million people gone in a flash of blue light that could be seen from space. The message was clear. Resistance would not be tolerated. Daniel stood in the command center watching the death toll climb on screens that showed news feeds from around the world. Paris was burning. Tokyo had gone silent. Moscow was under a strange energy field that prevented any communication. And through it all, the alien ships just waited like patient predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. He was about to give up hope when he remembered something. A file that had been passed down through generations of military leadership. A file that everyone assumed was a joke or a hoax or the ravings of some long-dead general who had lost his mind. Daniel had read it once years ago and laughed at its contents. He was not laughing now. He pulled out his secure tablet and searched for the file. It was buried deep in classified archives that most people did not even know existed. The file was called Project, and it spoke of something hidden beneath the ice of Antarctica. Something old, something powerful, something that was supposed to wake up when humanity faced extinction. Daniel made 2 calls. The first was to Admiral Cole, who commanded what remained of the Pacific Fleet. She was a tough woman who had never backed down from any fight, and she answered on the first ring. The second call was to a research station in Antarctica that officially did not exist. A man named Price answered, and when Daniel asked if Project was still operational, there was a long pause before said yes. Arrived at station 6 hours later on a transport that had somehow avoided alien detection. The invasion was in full swing now. Millions were dead, and millions more were being rounded up by alien ground forces that had begun landing in major cities. They were efficient and merciless, and they treated humans the way humans might treat insects. Met at the landing pad and led her to an elevator that descended deep into the ice. They went down for almost 20 minutes, passing through frozen rock that had not seen sunlight in millions of years. asked what was down there, and said he would show her because words would not be enough. The elevator opened into a vast underground chamber lit by soft blue lights that pulsed like heartbeats. Stepped out and stopped breathing for a moment. The chamber stretched for miles in every direction, and it was filled with pods. Thousands upon thousands of pods arranged in perfect rows, each one containing a human figure suspended in glowing blue liquid. Explained that these were not ordinary humans. They were warriors created 12,000 years ago to fight an enemy that had come from the stars. That enemy had nearly wiped out humanity, but these warriors had stopped them and saved the species. When the war ended, they went asleep beneath the ice, programmed to wake only when Earth faced another extinction-level threat. Asked how this was possible, said he did not know. The technology was beyond anything modern science could explain. The power systems had been running for 12 without failing. The warriors had not aged a single day. Above them, the sky burned as alien weapons continued their assault. Knew that human civilization had hours left at most. She looked at the pods and saw faces that could have belonged to anyone on the street. Men and women who had given up their lives 12,000 years ago to protect a future they would never see. She placed her hand on the activation panel and asked what would happen when she pressed it. Said the warriors would wake and they would fight. That was what they were made for. Thought about the millions already dead and the billions who would follow if nothing changed. She thought about her own children hiding in a bunker somewhere praying their mother would save them. She pressed the panel. The pods began to open one by one. Blue liquid drained away, revealing bodies covered in strange scars that glowed faintly in the dim light. Eyes that had been closed for 12,000 years snapped open and looked around with perfect clarity. The first warrior to rise was a woman with silver-white hair and eyes the color of winter storms. She stepped out of her pod and stood tall despite the weight of ages pressing down on her shoulders. Her name, according to ancient records, was Commander Grace Morgan. She looked at and spoke in a voice that was rough but strong. She asked one simple question. "Where is the enemy?" Grace Morgan stood in the underground chamber surrounded by thousands of pods that were opening one after another. Warriors stepped out of their long sleep with movements that were slow at first but grew stronger with each passing second. They did not speak or ask questions. They simply looked to Grace and waited for orders. Watched in silence as the ancient army assembled before her eyes. These were not ordinary soldiers. Their bodies were different somehow. Taller and more muscular than normal humans with skin that seemed to shimmer faintly in the blue light. Their eyes tracked movement with unnatural precision, and when they moved it was with a grace that no modern athlete could match. Approached Grace carefully like a man approaching a wild animal he was not sure would bite. He held out a small device and explained that it was a neural interface that would allow her to access all of human history since her sleep began. 12,000 years of knowledge compressed into a data stream that could be absorbed in minutes. Grace took the device and pressed it against her temple. Her eyes went blank for a moment as information flooded into her enhanced brain. Saw expressions flicker across the ancient warrior's face. Surprise, sadness, anger, wonder. 12 of human triumph and failure playing out in her mind like a film on fast forward. When it was over, Grace removed the device and handed it back to. She said that humanity had grown much since her time. They had built great cities and traveled to the moon and created machines that could think. But they had also forgotten the old enemy and the price that was paid to defeat it. That was a mistake. Asked what she meant by the old enemy. Grace said that 12,000 years ago something came from the void between stars. It was not the It was something older and darker and far more terrible. Her people had been created to fight that enemy and they had won, but the victory had cost everything. The civilization that built them was destroyed in the war, and only these warriors remained. A younger warrior approached Grace and saluted with a fist against his chest. His name was Samuel Drake, and he had been Grace's second in command before the long sleep. He reported that all 50,000 warriors were now awake and awaiting orders. Their bodies were functioning at optimal levels despite the centuries of dormancy. Another warrior joined them, a woman named Maria Santos, whose dark eyes seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She had been the leader of infiltration units during the Old War, and her body had been modified to adapt to any environment. She could survive in conditions that would kill a normal human in seconds. Grace turned to and asked about the current enemy, explained what she knew about their fleet size, their weapons, their demands. Grace listened without expression, and when finished the ancient commander simply nodded. She said they were not the same as the old enemy, but they were similar enough. Conquerors who saw other species as resources to be exploited. Her warriors had been designed to fight exactly this kind of threat. Asked how they planned to fight 17,000 warships with no fleet of their own. Grace smiled for the first time, and it was not a comforting expression. She told to show what else was hidden beneath the ice. They descended another mile through tunnels that had been carved from frozen rock long before the pyramids were built. The walls were covered in symbols that could not read, but Grace traced them with her fingers like greeting old friends. She said these were the words of her creators, warnings and instructions for the warriors who would one day wake to defend Earth again. The tunnel opened into a cavern so vast that could not see the far walls, and floating in that cavern were ships, 12 massive vessels, each 1/2 mile long with hulls that gleamed like liquid metal. They hung motionless in the air without any visible means of support, and their surfaces rippled with patterns of light that seemed almost alive. Said they had discovered these ships decades ago, but never found a way to activate them. The technology was beyond anything humanity could understand. Even the materials they were made from did not exist on any periodic table. Grace walked toward the nearest ship and placed her palm against its hull. Light spread from her touch like ripples in a pond, and the ship hummed to life with a sound that resonated in its bones. One by one, the other vessels responded until all 12 were glowing with power that had been dormant for 12,000 years. Grace explained that these ships were called Sentinels. They had been built from technology salvaged from the old enemy and improved upon by human engineers who understood that another threat would eventually come. Each ship could carry 4,000 warriors and was armed with weapons that could crack planets in half. Asked if the ships could really stand against the fleet. Grace said they would find out soon enough, but she remembered fighting enemies far worse than these alien invaders. Her warriors had been created to win impossible battles, and that was exactly what they intended to do. Samuel Drake began organizing the warriors into combat units, while Maria Santos prepared infiltration teams for boarding actions. The ancient army moved with a coordination that seemed almost telepathic. They did not need spoken commands to know what was required. They had trained together for centuries before the long sleep, and those instincts had not faded. Above them, the invasion continued. More cities fell. More humans died. The alien commander, a creature called High Executor, had grown bored with waiting for surrender. He ordered his fleet to begin full harvesting operations ahead of schedule. In the Pentagon Command Center, Daniel watched the horror unfold on screens that showed death on a scale humanity had never experienced. He had sent to Antarctica hoping for a miracle, but hours had passed without word. He was beginning to think Project was just a myth after all. Then his console beeped with an incoming transmission. It was, and her voice was shaking, but not from fear. She said that help was coming. She said to tell the world not to give up hope. Daniel asked what she had found down there, paused, and when she spoke again there was wonder in her voice. She said she had found humanity's true defenders, warriors who had been sleeping beneath the ice since before recorded history began, and they were very, very angry about what the aliens were doing to their planet. The first sentinel broke through the Antarctic ice sheet like a whale breaching the surface of the ocean. It rose into the sky trailing crystals of frozen water that sparkled in the light of burning cities. Behind it came 11 more ships, each one carrying 4,000 warriors ready for battle. Grace Morgan stood on the bridge of the lead vessel looking up at the alien fleet that filled the sky. She had fought monsters from beyond the stars 12,000 years ago, and she had won. These were about to learn what that really meant. She opened a channel to all 12 ships and gave a single command. Attack! The Sentinel fleet rose through the clouds and into orbit where the Armada waited like a wall of metal and death. High Executor watched the 12 ships approach on his display screen and felt something he had not experienced in centuries of conquest: confusion. His sensors could not identify the vessels. Their energy signatures matched nothing in databases, and the materials of their hulls were completely unknown. He ordered his science officers to analyze the newcomers, but they returned only errors and impossible readings. Was not worried. He had 17,000 warships under his command. 12 primitive vessels from a primitive world could not possibly pose a threat. He ordered the nearest battle group to intercept and destroy the intruders. 500 warships moved to engage the Sentinels. They opened fire with plasma cannons that had melted the defenses of 100 conquered worlds. Blue fire streaked across the void and slammed into the ancient human vessels. Nothing happened. The plasma simply washed over the Sentinel hulls like water over stone, leaving no damage at all. The shields that protected Grace Morgan's fleet were not like anything they had encountered. They absorbed energy and converted it into power for the ships themselves. Grace stood on her bridge watching the enemy attack with calm eyes. Samuel Drake reported that all vessels were at full combat readiness. Maria Santos confirmed that boarding teams were prepared and waiting. The ancient warriors were eager for battle after their long sleep. Grace gave the order to return fire. The Sentinels unleashed weapons that had been designed to fight nightmares from the void between galaxies. Beams of concentrated gravity tore through shields like they were made of paper. Missiles that existed partially outside normal space appeared inside enemy ships and detonated before anyone could react. In 30 seconds, 200 warships became expanding clouds of debris. Watched his display in disbelief as ship after ship vanished from his fleet roster. This was not possible. The Dominion had crushed species far more advanced than these humans. They had weapons that could crack moons and shields that could withstand the heat of stars. How were these primitive vessels destroying them so easily? He ordered a full fleet engagement. All 17,000 ships turned their weapons on the 12 Sentinels and opened fire at once. The void between Earth and its moon became a storm of plasma and missiles and energy beams that would have annihilated any normal fleet 1,000 times over. The Sentinels flew through the storm without slowing down. Their shields held against everything that could throw at them, and their weapons continued to tear the alien armada apart piece by piece. Grace maneuvered her ship with thoughts transmitted directly through the neural interface connecting her to the vessel. She and the Sentinel were one being, now fighting as a single unit. Samuel Drake led the first boarding action. His shuttle punched through the weakened shields of a command ship and crashed directly into its hull. Warriors poured out before the smoke cleared, cutting through alien soldiers, with blades that hummed with energy and guns that fired projectiles moving faster than light. They were larger than humans. Stronger too, with 4 arms and thick armor plating that grew naturally from their skin. They had conquered thousands of species in hand-to-hand combat and believed themselves unbeatable in close quarters. They were wrong. Samuel moved through the enemy ship like death itself. His enhanced reflexes let him dodge attacks before they were fully launched. His modified muscles gave him strength that matched the 4 armed aliens despite his smaller size. The warriors behind him fought with a precision that came from centuries of training and genetic engineering, designed for exactly this kind of battle. Maria Santos took a different approach. Her team did not fight their way through the enemy flagship. They simply appeared inside it. Her body could shift through solid matter for short distances, a modification that had been designed for infiltration during the Old War. She led her soldiers directly to the ship's power core and planted charges that would tear the vessel apart from within. On Earth, Daniel watched the battle unfold on screens that showed feeds from satellites that had somehow survived the invasion. He saw the Sentinel fleet carving through the Armada like a hot knife through butter. He saw alien ships exploding one after another in flashes of light that lit up the night sky. Laura stood beside him, tears streaming down her face. She had spent her career searching for signs of alien life, hoping that humanity would one day make contact with other civilizations. She had dreamed of peaceful first contact, an exchange of knowledge and friendship between species. Instead, she had witnessed an invasion that killed millions, and now she was watching a battle that killed millions more. But at least humanity was fighting back. At least they had a chance. The battle raged for 6 hours. The fleet had numbers on their side, but the Sentinels had technology that was beyond anything the aliens had ever encountered. More importantly, they had warriors who had been created for war. Not trained or recruited, but literally built to fight and win against overwhelming odds. By dawn, the Armada was broken. 8,000 ships had been destroyed outright. Another 5,000 were crippled and drifting without power. The survivors were fleeing toward the edge of the solar system, desperate to escape the ancient human vessels that pursued them without mercy. Grace Morgan stood on her bridge, looking at the field of debris that had once been an invasion fleet. She felt no joy in the victory, only a grim satisfaction that her warriors had done what they were created to do. Cole contacted her from the command center in Antarctica. She asked what came next. Grace said they needed to interrogate the captured enemy officers. She needed to know why they had come to Earth and whether more would follow. Samuel Drake brought High Executor to the Sentinel Bridge in chains. The alien commander had been captured during the final assault on his flagship. He was wounded and broken, but his eyes still burned with defiance. Grace approached him and spoke in a language that made his face go pale with shock. She was speaking. The neural interface had given her all of human history, including the linguistic analysis that Laura had performed on alien transmissions. She asked one question: "Who sent you?" The alien laughed despite his pain. He said they were merely servants, collectors for an entity that had ruled this galaxy for millions of years. An entity that fed on intelligent species and had marked Earth for harvest long before they even existed. Grace felt cold settle into her bones. She knew what was describing. She had fought something like it 12,000 years ago, something old and dark and hungry that came from the spaces between stars. She had thought that enemy was destroyed. She had been wrong. The war for Earth was over. But the war for survival had only just begun. The world changed in the weeks following the battle. News spread across every continent that humanity had been saved by warriors who had slept beneath Antarctic ice for 12,000 years. Some people celebrated in the streets while others fell to their knees in prayer. Many simply sat in stunned silence, trying to process a reality that no longer made sense. Grace Morgan met with world leaders in a bunker deep beneath Geneva. Presidents and prime ministers and generals gathered around a long table staring at the ancient warrior who had saved their species. She did not look like a hero from legend. She looked tired and worn and older than her physical appearance suggested. She told them the truth without softening it. They were gone, but something far worse was coming. An entity that had existed for millions of years, feeding on intelligent life across the galaxy. It had sent them to harvest Earth, and when those servants failed to return it, would send something stronger. Daniel asked how much time they had. Grace said she did not know. Could be years, could be months, could be weeks. The entity did not think like mortal beings. Time meant nothing to something that had existed since before the stars were born. Cole asked what they could do. Grace said humanity needed to prepare, build more ships, train more warriors, develop weapons that could hurt the enemy when it finally arrived. The Sentinels were powerful, but 12 ships would not be enough to face what was coming. The leaders argued among themselves for hours. Some wanted to hide and hope the enemy never found them. Others wanted to surrender before the fighting even started. A few talked about using nuclear weapons to destroy the Sentinels and returning to normal life, as if the invasion had never happened. Grace listened to all of it without speaking. When the arguing finally stopped, she stood and addressed the room one final time. She said that her warriors had been created 12,000 years ago because humanity faced extinction. They had sacrificed everything to give the species a chance to survive. Now that chance was here, and humanity could either fight for its future or lie down and die. She walked out of the room without waiting for a response, followed her into the corridor, and asked what she planned to do if the world leaders refused to cooperate. Grace said she would fight anyway. That was what she was made for. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. People began to volunteer. Soldiers and scientists and engineers from every nation came forward offering to help prepare for the coming threat. They had seen what that did to Earth. They had watched cities burn and millions die. They were not going to let that happen again. Price established research facilities around the world where human scientists worked alongside Grace's warriors to understand the ancient technology. The Sentinels were beyond anything modern engineering could explain, but that did not stop people from trying. Every day brought new discoveries and new questions. Samuel Drake began training programs for volunteers who wanted to become warriors. The enhancement process that had created Grace's soldiers could not be fully replicated, but modified versions were possible. They would not produce warriors as powerful as the originals, but they would create soldiers far stronger and faster than normal humans. Maria Santos focused on intelligence gathering. She sent teams to interrogate captured and analyze data recovered from their ships. Piece by piece, she assembled a picture of the enemy that had ruled the galaxy for so long. She learned that it was not a single being but a collective. Billions of minds linked together into one vast intelligence that spanned entire star systems. It consumed species not for food but for knowledge and experience. Every civilization it absorbed made it stronger and smarter and more dangerous. Grace studied the intelligence reports and felt fear for the first time in 12,000 years. The enemy she had fought in the old war had been a fragment of this collective, a tiny piece that had broken off and drifted to Earth by accident. They had barely defeated that fragment, and it had nearly wiped out humanity in the process. Now they would face the whole thing. She called a meeting with her lieutenants and laid out her plan. They could not wait for the enemy to come to them. They needed to take the fight outward, strike at the collective's servants before they could gather strength, show the galaxy that humanity was not prey but predator. Samuel said it was a bold plan. Maria said it was insane. Grace said it was their only chance. The Sentinel fleet began launching raids into territory within a month. They struck supply depots and communication stations and shipyards where new warships were being built. Each attack was fast and brutal, leaving nothing behind but wreckage and fear. Word spread through the galaxy. The primitive species from the backwater world called Earth had defeated a harvest fleet. Now they were hunting the survivors. Now they were coming for anyone who served the collective. Other species began to take notice. Civilizations that had lived in fear of the collective for generations watched the human attacks with growing hope. Some sent secret messages offering support. Others simply stayed out of the way and watched to see what would happen next. Grace knew they were buying time. Each raid delayed the collective's response and gave Earth more opportunity to prepare. But eventually, the enemy would react. Eventually, something would come that made them look like children playing with toys. She stood on the bridge of her Sentinel watching stars streak past as they traveled between systems. had joined the fleet as Earth's official representative, and she stood beside Grace now looking out at the endless void. Asked if they could really win this war, Grace said she did not know. 12,000 years ago they had fought a fragment and barely survived. Now they faced the whole collective and humanity was still recovering from the invasion. But she also said that humanity had changed since the old war. They had grown and learned and developed technologies that her creators could never have imagined. The modern weapons they were integrating with ancient systems were proving more effective than expected. More importantly, humanity had something the collective could never understand. They had the will to fight even when victory seemed impossible. They had faced extinction before and clawed their way back from the edge. They would do it again. Asked how Grace could be so sure, the ancient warrior smiled, and for a moment she looked almost human. She said she had slept for 12,000 years and dreamed of the species she was created to protect. She had dreamed of their struggles and triumphs and failures. She had watched them fall and rise again more times than she could count. Humanity was not the strongest species in the galaxy, not the oldest or the most advanced, but they were stubborn. They refused to surrender even when surrender was the logical choice. They kept fighting when any rational being would have given up. That stubbornness had saved them before. It would save them again. The Sentinel fleet jumped to the next target, and the war continued. 1 year after the invasion, Earth had become a fortress. Shipyards on every continent worked around the clock producing vessels based on Sentinel designs modified with modern technology. Training facilities turned out thousands of enhanced soldiers every month. Weapons laboratories developed new ways to hurt an enemy that had never known defeat. Grace Morgan stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York. The chamber was packed with delegates from every nation, and millions more watched on screens around the world. This was the moment humanity had been building toward, the moment they would learn whether a year of preparation had been enough. She told them that scouts had detected movement at the edge of the solar system. The collective had finally responded to the raids on its territory. A fleet was coming, not like though with their 17,000 ships. This was something else entirely. The images she displayed made delegates gasp and cry out in fear. Ships that stretched for hundreds of miles, structures that looked more like living organisms than machines, an armada that numbered in the hundreds of thousands advancing toward Earth like a tide of darkness. Grace let the fear wash over the room before she spoke again. She said that humanity had faced extinction before. 12,000 years ago her warriors had stood against an enemy just as terrible, and they had won. Now it was time to do it again. But this time they would not fight alone. Delegates murmured in confusion as Grace explained what had happened during the past year of raids. The collective had ruled through fear for millions of years. Species obeyed because they believed resistance was impossible. But humanity had shown them something different. Humanity had shown them that the collective could be hurt. Now those species were ready to fight back. Fleets from a dozen civilizations were gathering at the edge of human territory. Warriors who had lived as slaves for generations were taking up arms for the first time. The collective had created enemies across the galaxy, and those enemies finally had hope. Samuel Drake reported from the bridge of the lead Sentinel. The Allied fleet had arrived and taken position alongside the human ships. Vessels of every shape and size stretched across the void in numbers that rivaled the approaching enemy. For the first time in galactic history, the collective would face a united resistance. Maria Santos coordinated intelligence from agents planted throughout enemy space. She reported that the collective was confused. It had never encountered anything like this before. Species were supposed to surrender or die. They were not supposed to fight back, and they were certainly not supposed to work together. Grace smiled at the reports. The collective's greatest weakness was its arrogance. It had ruled for so long that it could not imagine being challenged. That arrogance would cost it everything. The battle began 3 days later at the edge of the solar system. Human ships formed the center of the Allied line with sentinels at the front. Alien vessels flanked them on either side, creating a wall of metal and energy that stretched for thousands of miles. The Collective's fleet advanced without hesitation. It had crushed countless species and absorbed their knowledge and technology. Each ship in its armada was the product of millions of years of conquest. Each weapon had been tested against civilizations that had once thought themselves invincible. Grace gave the order to attack, and the void erupted in fire. The fighting was brutal beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. Ships exploded by the hundreds on both sides, filling space with debris and death. The Collective adapted to Allied tactics within minutes, forcing Grace to constantly change strategies. Samuel led boarding parties against enemy command vessels, while Maria's infiltration teams disrupted communications. Daniel coordinated the defense of Earth from the Pentagon Command Center. Ground-based weapons joined the battle when enemy ships broke through the Allied lines. Missiles streaked upward from every continent, adding human fury to the cosmic struggle above. Laura worked with Price to analyze enemy weaknesses in real time. They discovered that the Collective's ships were linked through a psychic network that allowed them to coordinate perfectly. If that network could be disrupted, the enemy fleet would lose its greatest advantage. Grace ordered her sentinels to target the network nodes. Weapons designed to fight the old enemy 12,000 years ago proved effective against the Collective's psychic links. One by one, the connections began to fail, and enemy ships started moving independently. The Collective panicked. For the first time in its existence, it felt something close to fear. These tiny creatures from a tiny world were actually hurting it. They were tearing apart a fleet that should have been unstoppable. It tried to retreat, but the Allied forces pursued without mercy. Species that had lived in terror for generations finally had a chance for revenge, and they took it with savage joy. Ships that had once conquered their worlds now burned before them, and they made sure the Collective saw every moment. The battle lasted for 2 weeks. When it finally ended, the Collective's invasion fleet had been reduced to scattered fragments fleeing in all directions. The Allies had paid a terrible price. Millions were dead and thousands of ships were destroyed. But they had won. Grace stood on her bridge looking at the field of wreckage that had once been the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. Stood beside her as she had throughout the war. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally asked if it was over. Grace said this battle was over, but the war would continue. The Collective still existed somewhere in the void between galaxies. It would rebuild and it would return someday. But humanity would be ready. They had spent 12,000 years growing stronger without knowing why. Now they knew. They had been preparing for this moment since before their own history began. Grace ordered the fleet to return to Earth for repairs and celebration. The species of the galaxy had won their first victory against an enemy that had ruled them for millions of years. It was only a beginning, but it was enough. On Earth, people danced in the streets and cried with joy. Strangers embraced each other without caring about nationality or race or any of the divisions that had once seemed so important. They were alive. They were free. And they had proven that no enemy was too powerful to defeat. Daniel stood in the ruins of a city that had been destroyed during the invasion. Reconstruction crews worked around him, clearing debris and laying foundations for new buildings. He watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and red, and felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. Grace Morgan landed her shuttle in Antarctica, where it had all begun 1 year ago. She walked through the empty chambers where her warriors had slept for 12,000 years. The pods were dark now. Their purpose had been fulfilled. Found her there and asked what she was thinking. Grace said she was thinking about the future. For the first time in her existence, she could imagine something beyond the next battle. A galaxy where species worked together instead of being harvested. a humanity that could travel among the stars without fear. Asked if Grace thought they would ever see that future, the ancient warrior looked at her with eyes that had witnessed more than any human should ever have to witness. She said she did not know, but for the first time she believed it was possible. The galaxy had come for Earth expecting easy prey. They had found something else entirely. They had found a species that refused to die, a species that turned enemies into allies and fear into courage, a species that rose from the ice after 12,000 years and saved not just their own world but the entire galaxy. They had found humanity. And humanity was just getting started.